Well, good morning. Thank you so much for welcoming here this morning. I'm with decked halls. Thank you so much. I know that wasn't for me, but thank you for... Yeah, the halls look very nice, though, I wanted to say. It's a joy to be with you here in worship at Ponce and Highland. My name is, again, Jason Smith. I work with the Alliance of Baptists, and I bring greetings from the Alliance of Baptists, a movement of about 140 churches around the country celebrating and worshiping and acting in the same spirit that is alive here at Ponce and Highland. Individuals and churches who are living out a theological home for folks who are excluded, living out partnership with other groups and focusing on justice together. So I wanted to come here this morning and thank you for your partnership with the Alliance of Baptists and for being a part of us. Thank you so much for your giving, for your spirit and the energy you bring to the Alliance of Baptists. And as Mimi mentioned, I've had the privilege, the honor over the past year to be present with you in developing a relationship with our partner in southern Mexico, with the seminary, the Mayan Intercultural Seminary. So Alan, Chuck, Linda, Leslie, Steve, and Kim, we all went on these on special visits to San Cristobal. We experienced earthquakes together. We slept on floors together. We were in a bus and got turned around because of protests and had to go the long way together. We have really experienced a lot, and I can tell you, the work that we're doing down there, that this congregation is investing their ideas and time and energy in, is so valuable because the folks down there are benefiting, and y'all here, I understand, are benefiting so much. So that partnership is one in spirit that is so meaningful, and so thank you for that. Well, I wanted to take time, too, to invite you to participate in the Alliance of Baptists. I wanted to extend a special invitation to our annual gathering in Washington, D.C. this April 26th through 28th. Our theme is What is Liberty Without Liberation? So focusing on liberation movements, focusing on how we can rekindle the spirit of liberation in us as churches, as individuals. So I hope you can come up to D.C. to join us in April. And if you're a student, 19 years or older, or you know of a student who's in college or grad school and seminary, anyone who's looking for plans next summer, our summer communities of service opportunities just opened up, and students can be placed in cities like Charlotte, Cincinnati, New York City, doing all sorts of cool social justice and ministry projects with Alliance partners. A few years ago, some students lived in Flint and did water advocacy with the community there. A few years ago, some students went to Chicago and worked with kids in tutoring in downtown lower-income neighborhoods in Chicago. So there are some awesome opportunities for students for next summer if you know anybody who's looking for the opportunity to serve. But again, I just wanted to say thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for your partnership with the Alliance of Baptists. Well, hope is full of the unknown. When I was a kid, my mom took me and my brother to visit a cave. As you heard, I grew up in Central America, in Costa Rica, and these caves were called the Venado Caves, and they're very close to a very active volcano in Costa Rica. And so this was not a Disney cave theme park experience, no. This was one where we had to put on helmets and goggles and needed like these big flashlights. And the whole time, all I could think about in the pitch black was everything that could go wrong. Everything that could go wrong. My boot could get trapped under there. I might not be able to make it under that waterfall there. Everything that could go wrong was going through my head. And really in the middle of this experience, I didn't think we were going to come out alive. I had so much hope that we would leave that cave. Yet my hope was full of the unknown. This morning, on the first Sunday of the season of Advent, we can see our friend the Apostle Paul considering the unknown with regard to his friends at the Thessalonian church. So this morning, let's sort through some of Paul's mail, because that's what we're doing when we go back and look at the epistles. And we'll see here that Paul, interestingly, was beginning to give up, beginning to worry about his friends at the Thessalonian church and really start to submit to fear. Paul's hope was full of the unknown. So as we open up Paul's mailbox, we read his short letter to the tiny Christian church in Thessalonica. Thessalonica is the capital city of the region, about 100,000 people, and Paul visits the church on several occasions, according to Acts. And this letter is a bit of a follow-up on the visit. This letter is really considered to be the earliest Christian text that's written, included in our New Testament. So very old, very, very old piece of work. And if there's one thing you should know about the Thessalonian church, it's that Paul feels pretty warmly about them. He praises the church at the beginning of the letter, and he feels very loving about his friends, the Thessalonians, and he hopes for their ministry to grow and to sprout and to thrive throughout the region. But hope is full of the unknown. Paul was unsure about his friends, and he hoped they were okay. As Paul spends time helping the churches in Athens and Corinth, he really worries about this little tiny church in Thessalonica. He worries whether they're still breaking bread together. He frets about whether they're still serving the orphans and the widows. He worries about persecution that may have come to snatch the little church away. And we can see this really early in the letter. In chapter 3, verse 5, if you go back a bit, Paul says, "I was afraid that somehow the tempter had tempted you and that our labor had been in vain." You ever thought, I haven't heard from them in a while. May not be too good news. When I was in college, I had an old Mitsubishi from the 80s, and it was full of problems. I had the hardest time getting it to start, always needing a jump. I didn't have a lot of money at the time to take it to the shop. So I was going out of town on a debate trip, and I had a friend, Dave, who said he loved to work on cars. You all have one of those friends, right? He did it all the time with his dad. He knows what's going on. So I said, can you take a look at it while I'm gone over the weekend? I thought, free work on a car, he can take a look at it. So I gave him the keys, and I hoped in the unknown, hoping he knew what he was doing. I didn't hear from him over those few days. I texted him a couple of times to see if things were going okay. And on Sunday when I got back, I said, Dave, I sent you a couple of text messages just checking to see what's going on. He said, Jason, the good news is I think your issues were with the oil filter. Really difficult fix on a car, by the way. Quick fix, I replaced it. The bad news is I snapped your fuel line and it won't start at all. So I had a Dave moment there where I had trusted him. So sometimes no news is good news. But other times, no news can be bad news. And bad news for Paul was indeed more serious. It was persecution. And so with persecution worrying him, worrying many Christians during this era, not having heard from the Thessalonian church, Paul sends his trusted aide, Timothy, on a mission to just check in on them, to see how they're doing. Paul says, I wanted to strengthen and encourage you for the sake of your faith so that no one would be shaken by the persecutions. But think about this. It really seems like Paul's the one who displays very little faith in this scenario. He's the one afraid of the unknowns, afraid that they had faltered. Paul, the first theologian of the church, writer of a quarter of our literature in the New Testament, Paul's hope was full of the unknown. But good news came back for Paul in verse 6. Timothy has brought us the good news of your faith and love. For this reason, during all our distress and persecution, we have been encouraged about you through your faith. Paul says, thank goodness you're okay, but not just okay, thank goodness you're thriving. And Paul's response to this good news is none other than a benediction, a prayer of blessing over this community, not only expressing thanksgiving, but calling on God to bestow love and joy and peace to this community that he loves so much. How can we thank God enough for you? And here's a funny line. He says, I want to see you again in the flesh, face to face, and I want to restore faith to you. But I'm wondering if it's Paul who needed his faith restored from this community. He confesses he thinks things may have gone south. Ye of little faith and hope, Paul. So he offers a prayer of blessing for guidance, but also for hope. He hopes in an imminent second coming when Jesus would return. And these are Christians who recognize that the day-to-day things were very, very temporary, that they should focus on the broader picture, that hope is a long-term idea, not just something we should live out on a day-to-day basis, but year-to-year basis. They knew that the tiniest bits of hope can change things dramatically, unbeknownst sometimes to those who are sowing those seeds of hope, because hope is full of the unknown. Vincent Speranza was a private in the U.S. Army in World War II. He served in the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium, and in the midst of the fighting, he went to visit a fallen comrade inside a church that had been converted into a hospital. And he witnessed the hell of war inside that sanctuary. Bloody towels strewn in all corners, pieces of young soldiers littering the stone floor, loud wailing throughout the halls, silent whispers of Hail Marys. The story goes he saw his friend in pain on a cot, and he said, "Hey, can I get you anything?" And his buddy said, "Yeah, give me a drink." So Vince went outside. He found a blown-up tavern, located the tap behind the bar counter, and poured out beer into the only thing that he had on him, his helmet. He went over and shared it with his friend, then the other soldiers in the hospital beds, then to everybody inside the church, to the judgmental eyes of his superior officers. Well, 65 years passed after this experience. Vince returned after these decades to Bastogne for the 65th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. In a conversation with some other European veterans, he told this story of how 65 years ago, I had my helmet and I used the tap and I went over and these soldiers, their jaws dropped. "You're the soldier who served the beer out of the helmet? You're famous throughout all of Belgium. You're famous throughout all of Europe." Most people thought that it was a rumor. They didn't realize it was an actual person. In fact, there's a brewery in Belgium in the 80s that began a beer called Airborne and sold it along with little tiny helmets, little tiny ceramic mug helmets. So his impact on this little community was felt for generations by just one small act, one small impact. In an interview, Vince says that while many focus on the interesting beverage and mug story that emerged in legend and in reality from his experience, he really hoped that people would remember the tremendous loss in the sanctuary that day, the ravages of the war. The most poignant moment for him was not about the beer, but was what inspired him most in that church. After he'd been serving, in one of the corners of the church, he met an older woman and a little boy. The young boy gave him the British salute and said, "Thank you." The woman wiped tears from his eyes, consoling him amid the tremendous loss, and whispered the words, "Je comprends." I understand. Friends, hope is full of the unknown. And hope may be tiny, but it's there. The tiniest bits of hope we have in the midst of unknown circumstances can change things dramatically. They can impact stories and people for generations. Something so small, something so tiny, something so unknown can have such a lasting effect and be with us until the very end. And yet it's hard for us to put our hands on it. Hope is like looking into a pitch-black cave, seemingly outside time and space, and praying you will see light on the other side. Hope is handing your car keys to a friend wanting to help you to get moving again. Hope is like seeing your fellow comrades bleeding on the ground and using a little pluck and creativity to cause a ripple throughout a country and a continent in a hope of peace. Hope is full of unknowns because hope is full of God, the greatest unknown that we know about. A hope that is dynamic, a hope that's on its way, a hope on the move, pouring into our lives, a hope in a God who meets us here on earth in the present to see our circumstances. To live into an unknown hope is to see a God dying on a cross and to stare into the darkness of 3 days only to see an empty tomb. To live in an unknown hope and dream of the coming of a Savior who would make justice and love paramount. Hope is full of unknowns, yes, because hope is full of God. And at the Alliance, we have so much hope in the unknown right now, just as many of you may. We're identifying our structures of white privilege and institutional racism, and we're not quite sure about how these conversations will end up. We're continuing partnerships in Cuba where they're advocating an end to the embargo. We're partnering with folks in the Republic of Georgia where they're embracing people of all orientations. And in Zimbabwe where they're ordaining folks, men and women, but they're excluded from evangelical leadership. All of these contexts, we're trying to live out an open, embracing gospel message. But we're being challenged by so many forces. And we're not sure how these will affect their ministry and their future. We at the Alliance live into hope for immigrants seeking justice who are getting tear-gassed themselves. Hope that we stop destroying a warming planet. Hope for a safer society where our friends at church, at synagogue, at movie theaters, at schools can be safe from gun violence. And we have hope that this unknown future will come because it is full of God. A few weeks ago on a flight, I had the opportunity to watch Won't You Be My Neighbor, the biopic about the life of Fred Rogers, a Presbyterian minister who started the show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And watching this film reminded me of so many deep memories I hadn't thought about in a long time, and how grateful I was for the themes that Mr. Rogers had shared. And one particular scene they mentioned in the movie was when Mr. Rogers brought out Jeff Ehrlicher, a young boy in a wheelchair who became a quadriplegic at a young age after undergoing spinal surgery to remove a tumor. This is a time in the 70s when people with disabilities were not acknowledged on any media or in any space and pretty much discriminated against in the early days of the ADA. And he spoke with him, and he sang a song, kind of a corny song. He said, "It's you I like." And in this scene, you can see the unknown hope. Mr. Rogers saw the bits of hope that were living in Jeff's heart, and Jeff likewise acknowledged the hope in Mr. Rogers as well. In a commencement address at Dartmouth in 2002, Fred Rogers explained what he meant by this corny little song. When I say it's you I like, I'm talking about the part of you that knows that life is far more than anything you can ever see or hear or touch. That deep part of you that allows you to stand for those things without which humankind cannot survive. Love that conquers hate, peace that rises triumphant over war, and justice that proves more powerful than greed. Hope is full of the unknown because hope is full of God. And thanks be to God. Amen.